On September 8th, 1157, within the heavy stone walls of the royal palace at Oxford, a child was born into a world already brimming with power, ambition, and quiet instability. His mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, had already lived a life that would have been remarkable for any ruler, let alone a woman in the 12th century. His father, Henry II of England, stood at the height of his authority, commanding lands that stretched further than any Western European ruler since Charlemagne. And yet, despite all that power, the world this child entered was anything but stable. That child would become known to history as Richard the Lionheart. But on that day in Oxford, he was simply the third son. And in the brutal logic of medieval inheritance, being the third son meant something very specific. You were not meant to rule the greatest throne. You were not meant to inherit the crown. Your destiny would be shaped not by expectation, but by opportunity, and by how fiercely you could carve your place in a world already claimed by others. Still, Richard's birth was no small event. The palace at Oxford, already a center of royal authority since the Norman conquest, was alive with movement. Servants hurried through corridors carrying linens and water. Clergy whispered prayers for a safe delivery. Guards stood watch, not just for protection, but as a symbol of the power concentrated within those walls. Because this was no ordinary family. Henry II did not rule a single kingdom. What later historians would call the Angevin Empire was something far more complicated, a vast web of lands held together not by a single system, but by overlapping rights, traditions, and loyalties. England, Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Aquitaine were all bound to him, but each followed its own laws, its own customs, its own expectations. It was less an empire and more a balancing act. And into this delicate structure, Richard was born. Unlike his older brothers, Henry, known as the Young King, and Geoffrey, Richard did not arrive during a time of uncertainty. By 1157, his father's power was solidified. Rebellions had been crushed, alliances secured, and the machinery of governance was fully in motion. The empire was stable, but only on the surface, because underneath that stability was constant tension. Every territory had nobles who resisted control. Every region had its own identity, and every alliance could fracture at any moment. Richard would grow up inside that tension. From the very beginning, his life was shaped by movement. His father rarely stayed in one place for long. Henry II was known for his relentless energy, riding across his lands, settling disputes, enforcing authority, putting out fires before they could grow into rebellions. The royal court moved with him like a traveling city. Knights, clerks, servants, advisors, all shifting from castle to castle, from England to France and back again. Richard's childhood was not rooted in one home. It unfolded across an entire continent. And that mattered, because as he grew, he absorbed not just the authority of his family, but the diversity of the lands they ruled. He heard different languages, Norman French in the courts, Latin in the churches, local dialects in the streets. He saw different customs, different laws, different ways of life. While other children might grow up understanding one culture, Richard grew up surrounded by many. But if his father shaped the structure of his world, his mother shaped its spirit. Eleanor of Aquitaine was not a passive queen. She was one of the most powerful and intelligent figures of her time, a ruler in her own right before she ever married Henry. Her lands in Aquitaine were not just vast. They were wealthy, cultured, and fiercely independent. And unlike the colder, more rigid courts of the north, Eleanor's court, especially in Poitiers, was alive with art, music, and ideas. This was where Richard would truly begin to take shape, because Aquitaine was different. It was not just a political territory. It was a cultural force. The region stretched across what is now southwestern France, covering lands rich in vineyards, trade routes, and coastal ports. Cities like Bordeaux and Poitiers thrived not only economically, but intellectually. Merchants moved goods across Europe. Scholars exchanged ideas. And perhaps most importantly, poets and musicians, known as troubadours, filled the courts with something rare in the medieval world: expression. These troubadours did more than entertain. They shaped how the nobility thought about honor, love, loyalty, and identity. They told stories of knights who fought not just for land, but for ideals. They sang of devotion, both romantic and spiritual. They created a vision of chivalry that would echo for centuries. And young Richard listened. He grew up surrounded by figures like Bernard de Vendôme, whose songs transformed poetry into something deeply emotional, and Marcabreau, whose sharp, often critical verses cut through the illusions of courtly life. Through them, Richard learned something that would define him. That power was not just about strength, it was about image, reputation, and legacy. But his education did not stop at poetry. At around the age of 7, as was tradition, Richard was placed under the guidance of tutors. His training became structured, intense, and relentless. Because even as a third son, he was still a prince, and princes were expected to be prepared for anything. His days filled with lessons in Latin, the language of law, religion, and diplomacy. He studied texts not just to read them, but to understand how rulers thought, how they acted, how they justified their power. He learned about warfare not just as violence, but as strategy. And physically, he was pushed hard. He learned to ride before he could properly command. He trained with weapons long before he would ever use them in battle. Sword, lance, bow. Each required discipline, strength, and precision. He practiced until movement became instinct. Because in the world he was born into, weakness was not tolerated. At the same time, he was taught the structure of power, how lands were governed, how taxes were collected, how disputes were settled. He learned about the roles of officials, the seneschals, the bailiffs, the castellans, each a piece of the larger machine that kept the territory functioning. And slowly, a picture began to form. Richard was not being trained to be a king of England. He was being shaped to rule Aquitaine. At first glance, this might have seemed like a lesser inheritance compared to his older brother's claim to England. But in reality, Aquitaine was one of the richest and most complex regions in Europe. Controlling it meant controlling trade, culture, and influence. But it also meant dealing with its greatest problem, its nobles. Because Aquitaine was not easily ruled. Its barons were powerful, independent, and often defiant. They were used to autonomy. They resisted central authority, and they did not easily accept orders, even from a duke. Richard would not inherit a peaceful land. He would inherit a challenge. And as he grew into adolescence, that challenge began to move closer. The education, the culture, the training, all of it was preparing him for a moment that was coming whether he was ready or not. A moment when he would no longer be just a third son, but a ruler. And when that moment arrived, it would not be gentle. It would test everything he had learned and reveal who he truly was. The moment when a boy becomes a ruler rarely arrives with comfort. And for Richard the Lionheart, it came wrapped in ceremony, but followed immediately by danger. On May 11th, 1172, inside the Grand Cathedral of Poitiers, beneath high stone arches carved with scenes of saints and kings, the 15-year-old prince stepped forward to claim something that was never going to be easy: authority over Aquitaine. The ceremony itself was magnificent, carefully designed to send a message to every noble in the duchy. Eleanor of Aquitaine stood there not just as a mother, but as a ruler handing over decades of power. For more than 30 years, she had governed these lands, navigating their politics, surviving rebellions, and maintaining a fragile balance among fiercely independent lords. Now, she was placing that responsibility into the hands of her teenage son. Richard knelt before the altar as the archbishop performed the rituals that had defined Aquitanian authority for generations. A ring was placed upon him, symbolizing his bond to the land. A sword was given, not just as a weapon, but as a promise that he would defend his duchy, enforce justice, and command obedience. But everyone in that cathedral understood something unspoken. A title did not guarantee obedience, especially not in Aquitaine, because Aquitaine was not like Normandy, where authority had been hammered into shape by generations of strong dukes. It was not like England, where royal administration had grown increasingly organized. Aquitaine was fragmented, its power spread across dozens of barons who controlled their lands almost like independent rulers. They paid homage when it suited them. They obeyed when it benefited them. And they resisted whenever they believed they could get away with it. So as Richard rose from that ceremony, dressed in blue silk trimmed with ermine, carrying the symbols of his new power, he was not stepping into control. He was stepping into a test. At first, the challenge came quietly. Messages that should have been answered were ignored. Dues that should have been paid were delayed. Disputes that should have been brought before the ducal court were settled privately by nobles who did not recognize Richard's authority. It was not open rebellion yet, but it was resistance. And then it became something more. The spark came from a man who embodied everything difficult about Aquitaine's nobility, Geoffrey of Rancon. Geoffrey was powerful, deeply rooted in his lands, and used to independence. His fortress at Tailbourg was not just a residence, it was a statement. Built on high ground overlooking the Charente River, it controlled movement through the region and symbolized his dominance. When Richard attempted to assert his authority, collecting dues, enforcing judgments, Geoffrey refused. Not quietly, not subtly, openly. He rejected Richard's demands, denied his authority, and made it clear that he did not see the young duke as someone worth obeying. And that defiance did something dangerous. It spread. Other nobles watched closely. Some had their own grievances. Others simply saw opportunity. If Geoffrey could stand against the duke and face no consequences, then why shouldn't they do the same? Names began to gather around the rebellion. Vulgarin of Angoulême joined, controlling key routes between major cities. Members of the Lusignan family, ambitious, aggressive, and always ready to expand their influence, aligned themselves with the resistance. What began as defiance was becoming a coalition. And suddenly, Richard was no longer a ceremonial duke. He was a ruler facing war. Now, this is where many young rulers would hesitate. They might attempt negotiation, seeking compromise, trying to avoid bloodshed. After all, Richard was only 15. These were seasoned nobles with experience, armies, and strongholds. But Richard made a decision that would define him for the rest of his life. He chose war, not because he lacked options, but because he understood something fundamental about Aquitaine. If he showed weakness now, he would never truly rule. So instead of negotiating, he gathered an army. Knights loyal to him answered the call. Infantry was raised. Supplies were gathered. And within a short time, Richard had assembled a force of around 800 knights and 2,000 infantry, a serious army by the standards of the time. This was not a symbolic show of force. This was preparation for a campaign. And Richard did not rush blindly into battle. What he did next revealed something that would later make him one of the most feared commanders in Europe. He thought like a strategist. Instead of charging directly at the strongest rebel fortress, he targeted the weaker points first. Smaller castles, outposts, and supporting positions that allowed Geoffrey's power to function. One by one, Richard moved against them, isolating the core of the rebellion. This approach required patience, planning, and discipline, qualities not always associated with young rulers. But Richard understood that war was not just about winning battles. It was about breaking systems. He established his base at Saints, a strategic location that allowed him to coordinate movements and maintain supply lines. From there, his forces spread out, striking at rebel positions, cutting off communication, forcing defenders into isolation. And then came one of the first major tests of his ability, Pons. The castle at Pons stood on rocky terrain, overlooking a river, naturally protected and heavily fortified. Many believed it could not be taken easily. But Richard did not rely on brute force. He relied on observation. His engineers studied the walls carefully, looking for weaknesses. And they found one, a section where the natural rock had been reinforced with weaker masonry. It was not obvious. It was not large, but it was enough. Richard concentrated his attack there. Trebuchets, massive siege engines, were brought forward, hurling stones against that single vulnerable point. At the same time, diversionary attacks were launched elsewhere, keeping the defenders distracted, unable to fully reinforce the threatened section. Day after day, the bombardment continued, and within 6 days, something remarkable happened. The wall broke, pawns fell, and that victory sent a message far beyond the battlefield. Because in medieval warfare, reputation was everything. News traveled fast, carried by messengers, merchants, and rumor. And the story that spread was simple but powerful. The young duke was not weak. He was dangerous. Almost immediately, cracks began to appear in the rebellion. Minor nobles who had supported Geoffrey started reconsidering their position. Some sent messages offering submission. Others withdrew quietly, hoping to avoid being targeted next. Richard did not need to defeat everyone. He just needed to make resistance look like a losing choice. And it worked. But the rebellion was not over. Because Geoffrey still held Tailbourg, and Tailbourg was no ordinary fortress. It stood on a steep hill, with the Charente River protecting one side and strong defenses on the other. Its walls had been reinforced. Towers provided overlapping fields of fire. Inside, a large garrison was prepared for a long fight. Taking it would not be quick, and Richard knew it. So instead of rushing into an assault, he chose a different strategy. He surrounded it, completely. 3 separate camps were established, controlling every approach. Patrols ensured no supplies could enter. No reinforcements could break through. The fortress was cut off from the world. And then, he waited. Weeks turned into months. Seasons changed. Winter came. This was one of the hardest parts of medieval warfare. Not the battles, but the waiting. Maintaining an army in the field during winter required discipline, resources, and strong leadership. Supplies had to be managed. Morale had to be maintained. But Richard held his position. Inside the castle, conditions grew worse. Food ran low. Morale weakened. The realization slowly spread among the defenders that no rescue was coming. And finally, in March 1174, Geoffrey surrendered. Now this moment is important. Because victory in medieval warfare was not just about defeating your enemy. It was about what you did afterward. Richard could have destroyed Geoffrey completely, taken all his lands, eliminated his power forever. But he didn't. Instead, he chose something more calculated. Geoffrey lost key castles, strategic points that ensured he could never threaten ducal authority in the same way again. Some were destroyed. Others were taken under Richard's control. But Geoffrey himself was allowed to keep enough land to remain a noble. Why? Because Richard understood something many rulers did not. Destroying powerful families entirely could create chaos. But controlling them, limiting them, made for a more stable rule. It was not mercy. It was strategy. And with that, the rebellion was broken. The nobles had tested him, and he had answered, not as a boy, but as a ruler. And the message was now clear across Aquitaine. The third son was no longer just a prince. He was a force to be reckoned with. But even as he secured his power in Aquitaine, something much larger was unfolding beyond his duchy. A conflict that would pull him into a war not just for land or power, but for something far greater. The victory at Tailbourg should have brought stability to Aquitaine. It should have allowed Richard the Lionheart to settle into his role, consolidate power, and begin ruling with confidence. But the world he lived in did not allow for long periods of peace, especially not within the Angevin dynasty. Because even as Richard was crushing rebellion in his own lands, a far more dangerous conflict was unfolding, one that would turn son against father. At the center of it all was Henry II of England. Henry was one of the most powerful rulers in Europe, but his greatest strength, his vast empire, was also his greatest weakness. It required constant control, constant attention, constant balance. And within that empire were not just subjects, but heirs, ambitious, frustrated, and increasingly unwilling to wait for power. Richard was not alone in this. His older brother, Henry the Young King, had already been crowned during their father's lifetime, a move meant to secure succession. But the title came without real authority. He was a king in name, but not in power, and that created resentment. Their brother Geoffrey of Brittany had his own ambitions, his own claims, his own frustrations. And then there was the influence of Louis VII of France, Henry II's longtime rival, who saw opportunity in every division within the Angevin family. The result was inevitable. In 1173, rebellion erupted. But this was not a typical rebellion of nobles against the king. This was a family war. Richard, along with his brothers, turned against their father. Now, this might seem shocking, but in the context of medieval politics, it was not entirely unusual. Power was not something handed down easily. It was contested, negotiated, fought over, even within families. Still, the scale of this revolt made it one of the most dangerous moments of Henry II's reign. Allies gathered quickly. Louis VII supported the rebellion, eager to weaken Angevin control over French territories. In the north, William the Lion joined the conflict, attacking English lands. Across the empire, discontented nobles saw their chance to rise. And suddenly, what had been internal tension became a full-scale war stretching from Scotland to southern France. For Richard, this created a situation unlike anything he had faced before. Because while he was fighting for his own authority in Aquitaine, he was also fighting against his own father's authority. And that meant navigating a world where loyalty was no longer simple. In Aquitaine, Richard continued his campaigns against rebellious nobles. But now, those campaigns were tied into a much larger conflict. Some of the same barons who resisted him also aligned themselves with the broader revolt. Others remained loyal to Henry II. Every decision became more complicated. Every alliance more fragile. But if there was one thing Richard had already proven, it was that he understood war, not just as chaos, but as structure, and he adapted quickly. One of the most significant moments of his involvement in the rebellion came with the siege of Limoges in 1174. Limoges was not just another city. It was strategically vital, controlling key routes between northern and southern Aquitaine. Whoever held it could influence movement, trade, and military operations across the region. And at that moment, Limoges stood against Richard. It supported Henry II. So Richard moved against it. Now, this siege would become one of the clearest demonstrations of his growing skill, not just as a fighter, but as a commander capable of handling large-scale operations. He approached Limoges with preparation, not impulse. Siege works were constructed carefully. Wooden towers were raised, allowing archers to fire down into the city's defenses. Trebuchets were positioned to target vulnerable sections of the walls. Every movement was calculated. But what made this siege particularly notable was something more unusual. Richard's forces employed incendiary weapons, early forms of what was known as Greek fire. This was not common in Western Europe at the time. The use of such techniques suggested that knowledge was spreading across regions, carried by alliances, shared through conflicts, adapted by commanders willing to experiment. Richard was one of those commanders, and it showed. The siege pressed on, combining pressure from artillery, constant harassment, and the psychological weight of being surrounded. Inside the city, defenders faced not just physical danger, but the growing realization that they were up against a leader who would not simply give up. Eventually, Limoges fell, and with it, Richard's reputation grew further. But even as he achieved success, the larger rebellion was beginning to shift. Because Henry II was not a ruler easily defeated. Despite facing attacks on multiple fronts, he responded with speed and determination. He moved across his territories, suppressing uprisings, defeating enemies one by one. His experience, his resources, and his relentless energy began to turn the tide. In England, rebel forces were crushed. In Normandy, defenses held. In Scotland, William the Lion was captured, an event that alone shifted the balance dramatically. And slowly, the rebellion began to collapse. For Richard, this meant facing a difficult reality. The cause he had joined, the rebellion against his father, was failing. And now, he had to decide what came next. Because in medieval politics, defeat did not just mean loss of land or power. It could mean loss of everything. Reconciliation was not guaranteed. Punishment could be severe. But Henry II understood something important. Victory was not just about defeating enemies. It was about restoring stability. And that meant dealing carefully with his sons. In September 1174, the conflict came to an end. Peace was negotiated. Richard, along with his brothers, sought forgiveness. And Henry granted it. Not out of weakness, but out of necessity. The empire could not function if it remained divided. And despite their rebellion, his sons were still central to its future. For Richard, the outcome was significant. He retained his position as Duke of Aquitaine. His authority was recognized. And perhaps most importantly, he had gained something that could not be given. It had to be earned. Experience. He had fought in a major, multi-front war. He had coordinated with allies. He had conducted sieges under pressure. He had navigated the complex relationships of medieval politics. He had seen both victory and defeat, and he had survived. But the lessons went deeper than that. He had learned how fragile power could be, even within a family. He had seen how quickly alliances could shift. He had experienced firsthand the consequences of rebellion and the importance of timing. And all of this would shape the man he was becoming. Because this was still only the beginning. The conflicts with his father were not truly over. The tensions within the Angevin family would continue to grow. And beyond Europe, events were unfolding that would soon demand attention on an entirely different scale. A crisis that would not be about internal power, but about something that would shake all of Christendom. The fall of Jerusalem. And when that news arrived, it would change everything. It would call warriors across Europe to arms. It would ignite one of the most famous campaigns in medieval history. And it would give Richard the stage where his name would echo far beyond Aquitaine. But before he could reach that moment, he would have to face the final years of his father's rule, and the choices that would lead him not just to war, but to a crown. The news did not arrive all at once, and that made it worse. It came in fragments, carried by exhausted messengers, whispered in courts, repeated with growing fear until it became impossible to ignore. By late 1187, across the castles and cathedrals of Europe, one truth was becoming clear. Something had gone terribly wrong in the Holy Land. And at the center of that disaster was a single name that now echoed with both fear and respect: Saladin. The turning point had come months earlier, on July 4th, 1187, at the Battle of Aquitaine, a battle that did not just end in defeat, but in total collapse. The army of the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem, once the shield of Christian power in the east, had been drawn into the burning hills near the Sea of Galilee. They marched under the weight of armor, under a relentless sun, cut off from water, harassed constantly. It was not just a battle, it was a slow destruction. By the time the fighting ended, the core of the kingdom's military strength was gone. Knights who had defended those lands for generations lay dead or captured. The great military orders were shattered. Leadership was broken. And from that moment forward, there was nothing left to stop Saladin's advance. One city after another began to fall. Acre, the vital port that connected the east to Europe, surrendered quickly. Jaffa followed. Ascalon, Gaza, each lost, tightening the noose. The defenses that had held for decades now crumbled in months. And at the heart of it all stood the ultimate prize, Jerusalem. When the siege of Jerusalem 1187 began in September, the situation was already desperate. The city still had strong walls, still had towers, still had history on its side, but it did not have enough men, not enough trained fighters, not enough hope. The defense fell to Balian of Ibelin, one of the few experienced leaders left. He organized what resistance he could, turning civilians into defenders, preparing for a siege that everyone knew could not last forever. But what happened next was not what many expected. Instead of storming the city and unleashing slaughter, Saladin chose negotiation. He understood the weight of Jerusalem, not just as a military objective, but as a symbol. On October 2nd, 1187, the city surrendered. Christians were allowed to leave, some ransomed, others enslaved, but the city itself was spared destruction. For the Muslim world, it was a triumph. For Europe, it was a shock that cut deeper than any battlefield defeat. Because Jerusalem was not just another city. It was the center of their faith, and its loss felt like something more than military failure. It felt like judgment. The reaction in Europe was immediate and intense. When the news reached Pope Gregory VIII, he understood the scale of what had happened. This was not something that could be ignored or delayed. Within days, he issued the papal bull Audita Tremendi, calling for a new crusade. His words were not calm or measured. They were urgent, emotional, and direct. He framed the fall of Jerusalem as punishment for the sins of Christendom, but also as a test, a challenge, a moment where faith had to be proven through action. And across Europe, that call began to spread. Preachers carried the message from city to city. Nobles gathered in halls to discuss what it meant. Kings weighed their options, not just politically, but spiritually, because joining a crusade was not just a military decision. It was a commitment that reshaped everything. It meant leaving lands behind, risking death, spending vast wealth, and stepping into a conflict far from home. Some hesitated. Others did not. Among the first to respond was Frederick Barbarossa, a ruler whose reputation alone gave weight to the cause. When he took the cross in 1188, it sent a message that this crusade would not be small or symbolic. It would be a massive effort, led by some of the most powerful figures in Europe. In France, Philip II of France, often called Philip Augustus, was slower to commit. His focus had long been on strengthening his own kingdom, pushing against Angevin control. But the pressure grew. Nobles expected leadership. The church demanded action. Eventually, he too agreed, taking the cross and preparing for what lay ahead. And in the Angevin world, the decision became deeply personal. Because for Richard the Lionheart, this was not just another campaign. It was something he had been preparing for his entire life, even if he did not fully realize it. Everything about him aligned with the idea of crusading. The chivalric ideals he absorbed in Aquitaine, the martial training that defined his youth, the desire for glory, for purpose, for something greater than internal politics. Where his father saw complications, Richard saw clarity. He did not hesitate. In November 1188, at a ceremony in Tours, he took the cross. The moment was public, symbolic, powerful. Before nobles and clergy, he committed himself to the expedition that would attempt to reclaim Jerusalem. And for those watching, it was clear this was not a reluctant promise. This was something he wanted, but wanting it and achieving it were two very different things. Because organizing a crusade was not simple. It required money, vast amounts of it. Armies had to be gathered, equipped, transported. Ships had to be secured. Supplies had to be stockpiled for a journey that could take years. And all of this had to happen while maintaining control over territories back home. Richard approached this with the same intensity he brought to war. Taxes were raised. Contributions demanded. The famous Saladin tithe, a 10% levy across Christian lands, became one of the key financial tools. Nothing was spared. Lands were sold. Offices were granted in exchange for funds. It was a massive mobilization of resources, pushing the limits of what medieval administration could achieve. At the same time, Richard made a critical strategic decision. He would not travel overland like many earlier crusaders. He would go by sea. This choice avoided the complications of passing through the Byzantine Empire, where tensions had often disrupted previous expeditions. It also allowed for faster movement, better supply control, and a more direct route to the eastern Mediterranean. It was a decision that showed foresight. But even as preparations moved forward, there was a growing problem. Richard was ready to go. His father was not. Henry II of England, now aging and increasingly burdened by conflict, hesitated. He saw the crusade not just as a holy mission, but as a risk. Leaving his empire, even temporarily, could open the door to enemies. Philip of France was still a threat. Internal stability was not guaranteed. The balance he had spent decades maintaining could collapse in his absence. So he delayed, and that delay created tension. For Richard, it felt like failure to act when action was needed. For Henry, it was caution in a world where one mistake could destroy everything. The gap between them widened. Arguments grew sharper, trust weakened, and as pressure from Philip Augustus increased, the situation began to unravel. By 1189, it was clear that this was no longer just about the crusade. It was about power. The final confrontation came not in a grand battlefield, but through a series of moves that showed just how far things had gone. Richard aligned himself with Philip. Together, they pressured Henry militarily and politically. It was a shocking turn, a son siding with his father's greatest rival. And Henry, worn down by illness, by years of conflict, by the weight of his empire, began to lose control. The campaign moved toward Le Mans, the city where Henry had been born. It was not just a strategic target, it was personal, and when Richard's forces advanced, it forced Henry into retreat. The man who had once controlled more land than any ruler in Western Europe was now being pushed back by his own son. Within weeks, the end came. Henry II fell ill, his strength fading rapidly. Surrounded by few loyal followers, he received the final blow, not from a sword, but from a list of those who had turned against him. Richard's name was among them, and that, more than anything else, broke him. On July 6th, 1189, Henry II of England died. And just like that, everything changed. Richard was no longer just the Duke of Aquitaine. He was now King of England. The crown he had never been expected to wear was now his. And the crusade he had committed to was no longer a distant ambition. It was his responsibility. The stage was set. The war for Jerusalem was waiting. And now, Richard would not go as a prince seeking glory. He would go as a king. The moment Henry II of England died in July 1189, the balance of power across Western Europe shifted instantly. There was no pause, no quiet transition, no time for reflection. Power in the medieval world did not wait. It had to be taken, secured, and defended immediately. And for Richard the Lionheart, now the undisputed heir, that meant moving fast. He did not linger in grief. Whatever personal conflict had existed between father and son was buried beneath necessity. Within days, Richard began asserting control over the vast Angevin domains, ensuring that no rival, internal or external, could exploit the moment of transition. Because even though he had won the struggle against his father, the world around him had not suddenly become safe. Philip II of France was watching closely, ready to take advantage of any weakness. Local nobles, always sensitive to shifts in authority, could still rebel if they sensed instability. The empire that Richard inherited was powerful, but it was also fragile. His first moves were calculated. He secured Normandy, Anjou, and the other continental territories, reinforcing loyalty among key nobles. He confirmed positions, rewarded those who had supported him, and made it clear that his rule would not be uncertain or weak. This was not just about control. It was about perception. A new king had to appear strong immediately or risk being tested. Then, in August 1189, Richard crossed to England. For a man who would become one of England's most famous kings, his connection to the country itself was surprisingly limited. He had spent much of his life in Aquitaine, immersed in its culture, its language, its conflicts. England, though central to his power, was in many ways secondary in his personal experience. But now, it was his kingdom, and it needed to see him. His arrival was met with anticipation and tension. England had not been untouched by the conflicts of the previous years. The machinery of government still functioned, but loyalty needed to be reaffirmed. Richard moved quickly, calling councils, securing castles, ensuring that the kingdom recognized him fully. And then came the coronation. On September 3rd, 1189, inside the great Abbey of Westminster, Richard was crowned king. The ceremony was grand, filled with ritual, symbolism, and the weight of tradition. The church anointed him, placing divine legitimacy upon his rule. Nobles swore loyalty. The crown was placed upon his head, marking the transformation from duke and rebel into sovereign king. But even this moment, meant to unify and celebrate, was not without tension, because Richard's focus was already elsewhere. The crusade. Everything he did in those early months as king pointed toward one goal: leaving. This was unusual, even by medieval standards. Most rulers, upon gaining power, would spend years consolidating it, strengthening administration, securing borders. Richard did the opposite. He began preparing to depart almost immediately. To do that, he needed something above all else. Money, and not just ordinary revenue. The kind of wealth required to launch a crusade on the scale he envisioned was enormous. Armies had to be paid, fleets constructed or hired, supplies gathered for a journey across continents. And Richard approached this challenge with relentless determination. He sold offices. He granted lands. He accepted payments in exchange for positions of authority. It was said, only half as a joke, that he would have sold London itself if he could have found a buyer. Nothing was off the table. This was not recklessness. It was focus. Richard understood that the crusade was not just a campaign. It was his defining purpose. Everything else could be arranged, delegated, or postponed. He placed trusted officials in charge of England during his absence, most notably William Longchamp, who would act as a central authority. This decision, like many others, was practical but risky. Leaving a kingdom in someone else's hands always carried the possibility of conflict, and England would indeed face tensions during Richard's absence. But at that moment, Richard accepted the risk, because staying was not an option in his mind. Meanwhile, preparations intensified across his territories. Ships were gathered along the coasts. Supplies were stockpiled, grain, weapons, armor, materials for siege engines. Soldiers were recruited not just from England, but from across his domains. Knights from Aquitaine, Normandy, Anjou, all drawn into the growing force. And as this happened, coordination with Philip II of France became essential. Despite being rivals, both kings were now committed to the same cause. They met, negotiated, planned routes, discussed logistics. It was an uneasy cooperation, shaped by necessity rather than trust. Each knew that the other remained a competitor in Europe, even as they prepared to fight side by side in the East. There was tension beneath every agreement. But for now, the crusade held them together. By the spring of 1190, the preparations were complete. Richard was ready to leave. And when he did, it was not quietly. He departed with a fleet and an army that reflected both his ambition and his resources. This was not a small expedition. It was one of the most significant military movements of the time. The journey itself would be long and dangerous, crossing seas where storms could destroy ships, passing through territories where alliances could shift without warning. But Richard embraced it, because this was the moment everything had been building toward. The boy who had grown up in the courts of Aquitaine, absorbing the ideals of chivalry and honor. The young duke who had crushed rebellions and proven his strength. The son who had fought against his father and emerged as king. All of that now led here, to a journey that would take him far from his lands, far from his throne, into a conflict that would define his legacy. As the ships moved out, carrying men, weapons, and ambition across the water, there was no certainty about what lay ahead. Only one thing was clear. Richard was not going to the Holy Land as just another ruler answering a call. He was going to make his name known. And before he ever reached Jerusalem, the journey itself would already begin to shape the legend. Because the road to the crusade was a battlefield of its own. When Richard the Lionheart finally set out in 1190, he did not step into a simple journey from one land to another. What lay ahead was not a straight road, but a chain of unpredictable events, each capable of reshaping his campaign before it even reached its true battlefield. The crusade, in theory, was about Jerusalem. But in reality, before a single clash with Saladin, Richard would already be tested in politics, in leadership, in war. The fleet that carried him was immense by the standards of the time. Ships gathered from across his domains, loaded with knights, infantry, horses, weapons, supplies, and something even more important, expectation. Every man aboard knew they were part of something far larger than a typical campaign. This was not just war. It was a mission tied to faith, reputation, and history itself. The initial stage of the journey brought Richard to Sicily, where he would meet Philip II of France. The island, sitting at the crossroads of the Mediterranean, was more than just a stopping point. It was a political center filled with its own tensions. The death of King William II of Sicily had created instability, and competing claims to the throne had thrown the island into uncertainty. Richard did not arrive quietly. Almost immediately, conflict emerged. His sister, Joan, widow of the Sicilian king, was being held under conditions Richard found unacceptable. For him, this was not just a diplomatic issue. It was personal. And when diplomacy failed to produce results quickly, he did what he had done in Aquitaine years before. He applied pressure. Richard seized the city of Messina in October 1190, using force to make his position clear. His troops moved in, securing key positions, asserting control, demonstrating that he was not a king who would wait patiently while his interests were ignored. The occupation of Messina sent a message to everyone watching, not just in Sicily, but across Europe. Richard acted fast, and he acted decisively. But this move also created tension with Philip. The French king, already wary of Richard's growing power, saw the seizure of Messina as aggressive and potentially destabilizing. The alliance between them, always fragile, began to show cracks even before the crusade truly began. Through negotiation, a temporary agreement was reached. Richard secured his sister's release and financial compensation. Order was restored, at least on the surface. But the relationship between the two kings had already been affected. Trust was limited. Competition remained. And both men knew that once the crusade ended, they would likely return to being enemies. When spring came in 1191, the journey continued. The fleets departed Sicily, heading east across the Mediterranean. But the sea, like politics, rarely allowed things to proceed smoothly. Storms struck. Ships were scattered. Some were driven off course, others damaged, others lost entirely. Among the ships separated from the main fleet were vessels carrying important members of Richard's entourage, including his future wife, Berengaria of Navarre, and his sister Joan. They did not reach their intended destination. Instead, they ended up on the island of Cyprus. Now Cyprus, at that moment, was not under stable or widely recognized authority. It was controlled by a man named Isaac Komnenos of Cyprus, a figure who had broken away from Byzantine control and ruled the island independently. His position was unstable, his authority not fully legitimate, and his behavior, especially toward unexpected arrivals, was unpredictable. When the ships carrying Richard's people arrived, Isaac did not respond with hospitality. He responded with hostility. Survivors from wrecked ships were mistreated. Requests for assistance were denied. It was not just an insult, it was a direct challenge. And when word reached Richard, his reaction was immediate. He turned toward Cyprus. This decision changed everything. Because instead of continuing directly toward the Holy Land, Richard chose to confront Isaac. It was not a diversion, it was a statement. No one, no matter how distant or seemingly insignificant, could challenge him without consequences. In May 1191, Richard landed on the island. What followed was swift, aggressive, and decisive. The forces of Isaac Komnenos were not weak, but they were not prepared for the kind of campaign Richard brought with him. Unlike drawn-out sieges or slow campaigns, Richard moved quickly, striking key positions, forcing engagements, refusing to allow his opponent time to regroup. The battle near Limassol demonstrated the difference in leadership. Isaac attempted resistance, but his forces were outmaneuvered. Richard's army, disciplined and experienced, pushed forward with confidence. Within days, control of the situation shifted entirely. Isaac retreated. Richard pursued. The campaign did not drag on for months. It unfolded rapidly, with Richard capturing key strongholds, cutting off resistance, tightening control. By the end of the campaign, Isaac was defeated and captured. Cyprus had fallen, and with it, Richard achieved something few crusaders had done before even reaching the Holy Land. He conquered a kingdom. This victory had enormous consequences. Strategically, Cyprus became a vital base. It provided supplies, a secure port, a staging ground for further operations. In a campaign where logistics could determine success or failure, this was invaluable. Politically, it enhanced Richard's reputation. News spread quickly. Before he had even faced Saladin, he had already defeated a ruler and taken control of an entire island. And personally, it reinforced the image that was beginning to form around him. Not just a king, not just a crusader, but a commander who acted with speed, confidence, and overwhelming force. During this time, another important event took place. Richard married Berengaria of Navarre on Cyprus. The marriage was politically significant, strengthening alliances, securing connections. But even this moment, one that might have been a pause, a break from conflict, existed within the larger momentum of the campaign. There was no true pause. Everything was moving forward. Once Cyprus was secured, Richard prepared to continue the journey. The island was left under new administration, its resources now part of the crusading effort. Ships were repaired, supplies were replenished, forces reorganized, and then, finally, the fleet moved again. This time, toward the Holy Land, toward the real war. Because while Richard had already fought, already conquered, already proven himself, none of that was the true objective. Ahead lay the city of Acre, where Crusader forces had been struggling for years. Ahead lay Saladin, whose victories had shaken Europe. Ahead lay the conflict that would define not just the crusade, but Richard's place in history. As the ships approached the coast, carrying the king and his army, there was no uncertainty about what kind of leader had arrived. The journey itself had already made that clear. Now, the world would see what he could do in the war that mattered most. By the time Richard the Lionheart finally reached the shores of the Holy Land in June 1191, the war had already been raging for years. This was not a fresh crusade stepping into untouched ground. This was a brutal, grinding conflict that had stalled, consumed lives, and tested the limits of endurance. And at the center of it all stood the city of Acre. Acre was more than just a city. It was the key. For nearly 2 years, Crusader forces had been trying to take it. The siege had begun in 1189, long before Richard ever set sail, led initially by Guy of Lusignan. But what should have been a decisive operation had turned into a nightmare. The Crusaders were trapped in a strange, almost suffocating situation. They were besieging the city, but at the same time, they themselves were surrounded by the forces of Saladin. It was a siege within a siege. Inside Acre, Muslim defenders held firm behind strong walls. Outside, Crusader forces struggled to maintain pressure, while beyond them, Saladin's army waited, harassing, attacking, preventing any easy victory. Supplies ran low. Disease spread. Morale fluctuated between hope and despair. The longer it dragged on, the more it felt like a war that could not be won. And then Richard arrived. But even his arrival did not come under perfect conditions. During the voyage, he had fallen ill, likely from scurvy or another disease common on long sea journeys. When he reached Acre, he was not standing tall on horseback, sword in hand. He was weak, carried on a stretcher, but that did not stop him. Almost immediately, he began issuing orders. Even from his sickbed, Richard threw himself into the siege. He inspected the situation, studied the defenses, evaluated the failures of previous attempts. Where others had been worn down by time, he brought something different: energy, urgency, and a refusal to accept stalemate. He reorganized the siege operations. Siege engines were constructed with precision. Trebuchets were positioned carefully, targeting weak points in the walls. Archers were deployed strategically, maintaining constant pressure on defenders. Every movement was deliberate. And perhaps most importantly, Richard coordinated with Philip II of France, who had arrived shortly before him. For a brief moment, the two kings worked together effectively. Their combined forces created a level of pressure that Acre had not yet experienced. Day after day, the bombardment intensified. The walls shook under the impact of massive stones. Defenders were forced to remain constantly alert, unable to rest, unable to repair damage fully. At the same time, Saladin attempted to break the siege from the outside. His forces launched attacks, tried to disrupt the Crusaders, to relieve the city, to turn the tide. But now, the Crusaders were no longer disorganized or exhausted. Under leaders like Richard, they held firm. And then, something began to change. The balance shifted. Inside Acre, conditions worsened. Supplies dwindled. The constant bombardment took its toll. Morale began to break. And as weeks passed, it became clear that the city could not hold indefinitely. On July 12, 1191, Acre surrendered. After nearly 2 years of struggle, the city finally fell. It was a massive victory. For the Crusaders, it was the first major success since the disaster of Aquitaine. It proved that Saladin could be challenged, that his dominance was not absolute. It restored confidence, not just among the armies in the east, but across Europe. And for Richard, it was the moment where his reputation exploded. He had arrived sick, late, stepping into a failing siege, and turned it into victory. But what happened next would become one of the most controversial decisions of his life. As part of the surrender, agreements had been made. Prisoners were taken, thousands of them. Negotiations followed regarding ransom, the return of relics, and the release of Christian captives held by Saladin. But delays began. Talk stretched on. Promises were not fulfilled quickly enough. And Richard, already under pressure to move forward, grew impatient. Then in August 1191, he made a decision that shocked even his allies. He ordered the execution of around 2,700 Muslim prisoners outside Acre. This was not done in the heat of battle. It was a calculated act. Richard justified it as a response to failed negotiations and as a message to Saladin that delays and broken agreements would not be tolerated. But even by the standards of medieval warfare, it was brutal, and it revealed something important about him. Richard could be strategic, disciplined, even calculated, but he could also be ruthless when he believed it necessary. After Acre, the crusade did not pause. The objective remained clear, Jerusalem. But getting there would not be simple. The army began its march south along the coast, moving carefully, aware that Saladin's forces were constantly nearby. This was no longer a static siege. This was a moving war where every step had to be protected, every formation maintained. And Saladin watched. He did not rush into reckless battle. He harassed, tested, probed for weakness. His cavalry moved in and out, launching attacks, retreating, forcing the Crusaders to stay alert at all times. This was a different kind of warfare. Not a single decisive clash, but a constant pressure. Richard adapted. He organized the army with precision. Infantry in the center, cavalry ready to respond, crossbowmen positioned to counterattacks. Discipline became everything. No one was to break formation. No one was to charge without command. Because Saladin was waiting for that mistake. And then, near the town of Arsuf in September 1191, the moment came. Saladin launched a full attack. His forces struck repeatedly, waves of cavalry pressing against the Crusader lines, testing their discipline, trying to provoke a reaction. For hours, the pressure built. Arrows rained down. Horses screamed. Shields splintered. And still, Richard held the line. He did not rush. He did not panic. He waited, because he understood something critical. The right moment in battle was everything. And when that moment came, when Saladin's forces were fully committed, when the pressure had peaked, Richard gave the order. The cavalry charged. It was sudden. It was powerful. And it broke through. The Crusader knights, heavily armored, moving with momentum, struck with force that could not be easily stopped. Saladin's lines wavered, then broke. The battlefield shifted from pressure to collapse. The Battle of Arsuf was won. This victory did not destroy Saladin's army, but it proved something essential. Richard could defeat him in open battle, and that mattered more than any single city, because now both sides understood each other. Saladin saw that Richard was not just another Crusader king, and Richard saw that defeating Saladin would not be easy. As the army moved forward, closer to Jerusalem, the stakes continued to rise. Victory was possible, but so was failure. And the decisions Richard would make next, whether to attack, to wait, to negotiate would determine not just the outcome of the crusade, but the legacy he would leave behind. After the victory at the Battle of Arsuf, the momentum of the crusade seemed, for the first time, to belong to Richard the Lionheart. The road south along the coast had been secured step by step, and the army now moved with confidence that had been missing for years. The capture of Jaffa soon followed, giving the Crusaders a vital port and a foothold deeper into the region. From the outside, it looked like everything was finally falling into place. The army was intact, morale was high, and Jerusalem, the ultimate goal, was now within reach. But war, especially in this land, was never that simple. Because while Richard had proven himself in battle, what lay ahead was not just another engagement. It was a decision that could determine the fate of the entire crusade. The march inland began cautiously. Moving away from the safety of the coast meant losing immediate access to supplies brought by sea. It meant stretching lines of communication. It meant entering territory where Saladin could strike more freely, where water sources could be cut off, where the environment itself could become an enemy. And Saladin understood this perfectly. He did not rush into another full confrontation like Arsuf. Instead, he adopted a strategy of pressure and denial. Wells were destroyed or poisoned. Crops were burned. The land ahead of the Crusaders was stripped of resources, turning the advance toward Jerusalem into a slow, exhausting push through increasingly hostile terrain. Still, Richard pressed forward. By early 1192, the Crusader army reached Beit Nuba, close enough to Jerusalem that the city's presence could almost be felt. Some accounts describe soldiers climbing hills just to catch a glimpse of it in the distance, the city that had driven them across continents, the place that had haunted Europe since its fall in 1187. It was right there, so close. And yet, Richard hesitated. This is the moment that defines him, not as a warrior, but as a leader forced to choose between ambition and reality. Because taking Jerusalem was not the same as holding it. Richard understood the situation clearly. Even if they captured the city, they would be deep inland, surrounded by hostile territory, cut off from reliable supply routes. Saladin's forces would not simply disappear. They would regroup, counterattack, and likely retake the city once the Crusader army weakened. Victory could turn into disaster, and Richard was not willing to gamble everything on a moment of glory that could not be sustained. But not everyone agreed. Many of the Crusader nobles wanted to advance. They had come for Jerusalem. To turn back now, when the city was within reach, felt like failure. Pressure mounted. Arguments grew. The unity that had been maintained after Acre and Arsuf began to crack. This was not just a military problem. It was a political one. Richard had to hold together an army made up of different factions, different loyalties, different expectations. Every decision risked dividing them further. And then he made the choice. He ordered retreat, not a chaotic withdrawal, but a controlled, deliberate pullback toward the coast. The reaction was immediate. Disappointment spread. Frustration turned into anger in some quarters. To many, it felt like the moment had been lost. But Richard was not finished. He regrouped, reorganized, and began considering alternative strategies. If Jerusalem could not be taken and held directly, then perhaps Saladin could be forced into a position where negotiation would become necessary. This phase of the campaign became a mix of military action and diplomacy. There were renewed movements inland, probing advances, attempts to create opportunities. At the same time, communication between Richard and Saladin began to take on a different tone. Despite being enemies, the two men developed a kind of mutual respect. Messages were exchanged. Gifts were sent. There were even discussions, remarkable by any standard, about potential alliances or arrangements, including the idea of shared control over Jerusalem or even political marriages to unify interests. These talks never resulted in a final agreement of that kind, but they reveal something important. This was not a simple war of destruction. It was a complex conflict where both sides understood the limits of total victory. Still, the fighting continued. In mid-1192, Saladin launched a sudden attack on Jaffa, attempting to retake the city and break the Crusaders' hold on the coast. The assault was fast and dangerous, catching defenders off guard. For a moment, it seemed like the city might fall. But Richard responded with speed that matched his reputation. He sailed directly to Jaffa, arriving with a small force, landing under pressure, moving immediately into battle. What followed was one of the most dramatic episodes of the crusade. Richard, leading from the front, rallied the defenders, pushed back the attackers, and stabilized the situation. The counterattack succeeded. Jaffa held. And once again, Richard had proven something. Not just his ability to command, but his willingness to act decisively when everything was on the line. After this, both sides were reaching their limits. The Crusaders had achieved victories, secured key positions, and demonstrated strength. But Jerusalem remained out of reach. Saladin had defended his territories, avoided catastrophic defeat, but could not fully drive the Crusaders out. The war had reached a point where neither side could achieve complete victory. And so, negotiations began in earnest. In September 1192, an agreement was reached between Richard and Saladin. The terms were clear. Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control, but Christian pilgrims would be allowed access to the city. The Crusaders would retain a strip of coastal territory, ensuring their presence in the region and maintaining a connection to Europe. It was not the victory many had hoped for, but it was not defeat either. It was a compromise, a recognition of reality. And for Richard, it marked the end of his time in the Holy Land. He had come with the goal of reclaiming Jerusalem. He left without it, but he also left with something else. A reputation. Across both Christian and Muslim worlds, his name had become known, not just as a king, but as a commander of rare ability, a leader who could win battles, hold armies together, and face one of the most formidable opponents of the age on equal terms. As he prepared to depart, the war behind him, the journey ahead uncertain, one thing was clear. The crusade had not ended his story. It had only transformed it, because the road back to Europe would not be peaceful, and the challenges waiting for him there would test him in ways no battlefield ever had. When Richard the Lionheart left the Holy Land in late 1192, he did not depart as a defeated man, but neither did he leave as a conqueror of Jerusalem. What he carried with him instead was something far more complicated. Victory in battle, respect from enemies, frustration from allies, and a reputation that now stretched across continents. But if the crusade had been a test of his strength as a warrior, what came next would test something entirely different. His survival in a world where swords were not the only danger. The journey home should have been straightforward. It was not. Richard chose to travel by sea at first, sailing west across the Mediterranean. But storms, the same unpredictable force that had shaped his earlier journey, returned once again. His ship was driven off course, battered, forced toward the Adriatic coast. Plans began to unravel. The direct route home became impossible. And so, Richard made a decision that would change everything. He would travel overland. Now this choice might seem practical, but in reality, it was incredibly dangerous. Because the lands between the Adriatic and his own territories were not neutral. They were filled with rulers who had their own interests, their own grudges, and in some cases, very specific reasons to want Richard captured. And among them was one man in particular, Leopold V, Duke of Austria. Leopold had been present during the Crusade, and his relationship with Richard had not ended well. During the siege of Acre, Leopold's banner had been raised alongside those of other leaders. But Richard, in a moment that would echo far beyond that battlefield, had ordered it removed, treating Leopold as inferior, unworthy of equal standing. It was a public insult, and in the medieval world, public insults were not forgotten. So when Richard, traveling in disguise, moving through territories far from his own power base, entered lands connected to Leopold, the risk became real. He tried to move quietly. He traveled with a small group, avoiding attention, disguising himself to pass unnoticed. But this was not a land where a king could easily disappear. His appearance, his manner, even the wealth he carried, These things drew attention, and eventually someone noticed. Near Vienna, in December 1192, Richard was recognized. Accounts vary. Some say it was because he spent money too freely, others that his identity was guessed through his behavior. But the result was the same. He was captured. The King of England, the man who had stood against Saladin, who had commanded armies, who had taken cities and fought battles that would become legend, was now a prisoner. Leopold did not hesitate. Richard was taken into custody, and from that moment, control over his fate shifted entirely. But Leopold did not keep him for long. Instead, he handed Richard over to an even more powerful figure, Henry VI, Holy Roman Emperor. Now the situation became far more serious. This was no longer a local dispute or a matter of personal revenge. This was a political opportunity of the highest level. The emperor now held one of the most powerful kings in Europe, and that meant leverage. Richard was imprisoned, moved between castles, kept under guard. And back in England, the news began to spread. At first, it was uncertain. Rumors traveled slowly. Some did not believe it. Others feared the worst. But eventually, the truth became clear. The king was gone, captured, and everything he had built, the authority he had secured, the power he had established before leaving for the crusade, was now vulnerable. Because while Richard sat in captivity, others began to act. His brother, John, King of England, saw opportunity. John had always been ambitious, always waiting for a moment where he could step forward. Now, with Richard absent, that moment had arrived. And he was not alone. Philip II of France, Richard's longtime rival, also moved quickly. The alliance of the crusade was gone. Now, with Richard unable to defend his territories, Philip began to push, seeking to take advantage of the situation. Together, John and Philip formed a dangerous combination: internal betrayal and external pressure. England faced instability. The Angevin lands in France were under threat, and Richard, the one man who could hold it all together, was locked away. But captivity did not break him. Even in prison, Richard remained what he had always been: defiant, aware, calculating. He understood his value. He understood that he was not just a prisoner, but a prize. And that meant he could not simply be executed or forgotten. He would be used. Negotiations began. The emperor demanded a ransom. And not just any ransom, an enormous one. 150,000 marks. To understand this, you have to realize the scale. This was not a simple payment. It was a sum so large that it required an entire kingdom to contribute. Taxes were raised. Churches were asked to give. Nobles were expected to provide. Across England, efforts began to gather the money needed to free their king. Even Eleanor of Aquitaine, now older but still formidable, took charge of the effort. She moved across the kingdom, organizing, pushing, ensuring that the ransom would be paid. Because this was not just about Richard. It was about the stability of everything he ruled. Meanwhile, Richard waited. Months passed. Time stretched. And yet his story did not fade. If anything, it grew. Stories spread of his captivity, of his resilience. Tales, even if not entirely true, began to circulate, like the famous legend of a minstrel finding him by singing beneath castle walls. Whether fact or myth, these stories added to his image. He was no longer just a king. He was becoming something else, a figure of legend. Finally, in 1194, the ransom was paid. Richard was released. After more than a year in captivity, he stepped back into the world, not as a broken man, but as someone who had survived yet another challenge. But everything had changed. His lands had been threatened. His brother had betrayed him. His rival had advanced. And now, the king who had left for crusade with ambition and purpose was returning to a different kind of war. Not in distant lands, but at home. And this time, the fight would not be for Jerusalem. It would be for his own crown. When Richard the Lionheart was finally released in 1194 after more than a year in captivity, he did not return to a stable kingdom waiting peacefully for its ruler. What he came back to was a fractured political landscape, one that had shifted in his absence, filled with betrayal ambition, and enemies who had already begun carving into what he had once controlled so firmly. But the moment he stepped back onto his own soil, one thing became clear. He was not weakened. If anything, he was sharper, more focused, and far less willing to tolerate disloyalty. His first actions were immediate and decisive. He returned to England not to rest, not to celebrate his release, but to secure control. The kingdom needed to see him, needed to recognize that the king had returned and that authority had not been lost. Ceremonies were held, loyalties reaffirmed, and perhaps most symbolically, Richard had himself crowned again at Westminster in April 1194. This second coronation was not about tradition. It was a statement, a clear message that whatever had happened during his absence, his imprisonment, the actions of his brother, the ambitions of his enemies, none of it had broken his claim. And then, just as quickly as he had arrived, he left England again. Because for Richard, England was never the center of his world. France was. More specifically, the territories he held across the Channel, the lands that formed the backbone of Angevin power. And those lands were now under threat from the one man who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Philip II of France. During Richard's captivity, Philip had not remained idle. He had moved aggressively, targeting Norman territories, encouraging rebellion, working closely with Richard's brother John, King of England, to destabilize Angevin control. It had been a calculated move, and now Richard was back to answer it. The war that followed was not a single campaign or a decisive battle. It was a relentless, ongoing conflict that would define the final years of Richard's life. It stretched across Normandy, Anjou, and beyond, involving sieges, skirmishes, strategic maneuvers, and constant pressure. And in this war, Richard was at his most relentless. He moved quickly, striking where Philip was weak, reclaiming lost territories, reasserting control. Towns that had shifted allegiance were brought back under his authority. Castles that had been taken were besieged and recovered. Every action was aimed at one goal, restoring the strength of his empire. But this was not just about reclaiming land. It was about proving dominance. Philip was not an easy opponent. He was cautious, intelligent, and increasingly powerful. Unlike many rulers, he did not rely purely on battlefield glory. He used strategy, patience, and political maneuvering to achieve his goals, which made the conflict between them something more than simple warfare. It was a contest of two very different styles of leadership. Richard, the warrior king, aggressive, direct, willing to risk everything for decisive action. Philip, the calculating ruler, patient, methodical, always looking for advantage. And between them, the land itself became a battlefield. One of the most important symbols of this struggle was a fortress, Château Gaillard. After regaining control of Normandy, Richard recognized that he needed more than just armies. He needed strong defenses. Château Gaillard was his answer. Built overlooking the Seine River, it was designed not just as a castle, but as a statement of power and engineering. Its position was strategic. Its design was advanced. Its construction was rapid, almost unbelievably fast for the time. And it reflected Richard's understanding that controlling territory required more than winning battles. It required holding ground. Philip understood this too, and he knew that as long as Richard remained active, aggressive, and present, defeating him would not be easy. So the war continued. Year after year, campaign after campaign, neither side achieving total victory, but neither willing to give ground. Richard fought not just as a king issuing orders from a distance, but as a commander in the field, personally leading troops, directing sieges, taking risks. He was in his element. This was the kind of conflict he understood best. And yet, despite all his victories, all his skill, there was something about this phase of his life that carried a different tone. Because this was no longer about crusade, no longer about Jerusalem. This was about survival, about holding together what he had inherited, about fighting not for glory, but for control. And then, in 1199, everything changed. The campaign that year seemed like many others, targeting rebellious territories, dealing with local resistance. One such target was a small castle in southwestern France. Not a great city, not a major stronghold. Caylus-Chabrol Castle. It was not supposed to be significant. It was not supposed to be the place where history turned. But during the siege of this castle, as Richard moved close to the walls, inspecting positions, directing operations, something happened that no grand battle, no powerful enemy had managed to achieve. A crossbow bolt was fired. It struck him. The wound did not kill him immediately. At first, it may not even have seemed fatal. But in the medieval world, wounds were dangerous, not just for the damage they caused, but for what followed. Infection. Over the days that followed, his condition worsened. The wound became infected, and without the medical knowledge to treat it effectively, there was little that could be done. Richard, the king who had survived crusades, battles, captivity, and political betrayal, was dying from a wound received at a minor siege. In April 1199, he died. And just like that, the life that had been defined by constant movement, constant conflict, constant intensity came to an end. But even in death, the story did not end quietly. Because Richard had not lived quietly. He left behind a legacy that was already becoming legend. A king who spent little time in England, yet became one of its most famous rulers. A warrior who faced Saladin and earned respect even from his enemies. A leader who inspired loyalty, fear, admiration, and controversy in equal measure. And perhaps most importantly, a figure whose life blurred the line between history and myth. Because over time, the details of his life would be retold, reshaped, amplified. Stories would grow. Legends would form, and the name Richard the Lionheart would become something larger than the man himself. But to understand that legend fully, you have to look at what remains after the battles are over, and what his life truly meant. That is where the final part of this story begins. When Richard the Lionheart died in 1199 after the siege wound at Caylus-Chabrol Castle turned fatal, the immediate political world did not pause to honor the man. It moved instantly to fill the space he left behind. Medieval power rarely allowed silence. A throne without its ruler was not a place of mourning first, but a place of competition. Within days, control of the Angevin lands became contested again. His brother John, King of England, succeeded him, but not with the same authority, respect, or fear that Richard had commanded. In France, Philip II of France immediately continued pushing to reclaim territories he had spent years trying to weaken from the outside. The structure Richard had fought so hard to maintain began to fracture almost immediately after his death. And yet something unexpected happened. Richard did not disappear. Not really, because some rulers are remembered for what they built. Others are remembered for what they destroyed. But Richard was remembered for something different entirely. How intensely he lived inside conflict itself. His reign became the kind that later generations struggled to categorize. In England, he ruled for roughly 10 years, but spent fewer than 6 months there. Most of his time was spent on campaign, in transit, or at war. And yet his image in English memory became that of a national hero. That contradiction is important, because it reveals something about how history works, not as a record of where someone spent their time, but how their story gets retold. Over the centuries, Richard's image transformed. Chroniclers, poets, and storytellers began shaping him into a symbol. The crusading king, the perfect knight, the warrior who embodied courage in its purest medieval form. Even his conflicts with Saladin were reinterpreted over time, not just as military history, but as a kind of moral duel between two great leaders of opposing worlds, something more symbolic than strictly factual. And this is where his story starts to connect with something broader, because Richard's legend did not stay in the Middle Ages. It traveled forward. It influenced how later generations thought about leadership, warfare, and heroism. Centuries later, during the age of empire and exploration, European rulers and writers would often look back at figures like Richard as a model, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously, for what a great king should look like. Even the idea of the warrior ruler, someone who leads from the front rather than behind a desk, carries echoes of him. But there is another side to this legacy, because the same romantic image that made Richard legendary also simplified him. The Real Richard was not just a battlefield hero. He was a political operator, a tax raiser, a strategist who made calculated decisions, including brutal ones, when he believed they were necessary. The executions after Acre, the endless taxation for war, the prioritization of his continental domains over England itself. These are not the details that usually survive in popular memory, but they are part of the truth. And this tension between myth and reality is not unique to Richard. It is something that appears again and again throughout history. If you look forward a few centuries, you can see similar patterns in how later figures are remembered. Leaders from the age of empire, revolution, or even modern warfare are often reduced in memory to a single defining trait: hero, tyrant, liberator, conqueror, when in reality their lives were far more complicated. Even in more recent times, figures like wartime generals or political leaders often get simplified into symbols rather than fully understood individuals. Richard's story is one of the earliest and clearest examples of this process. A real man becomes a legend. A legend becomes a narrative. And the narrative survives longer than the truth in many cases. But perhaps the most important thing about Richard is not whether he was purely heroic or purely ruthless. It is the fact that he lived in a world where power had to be constantly defended. There was no stable center, no permanent peace. Every territory had to be held by force, negotiation, or fear. And in that environment, survival itself required a certain kind of personality, decisive, mobile, aggressive when necessary, and endlessly alert to threat. That is why his reign looks so different from modern ideas of leadership. Today, power is often associated with institutions, systems, and long-term administration. In Richard's world, power was far more personal. It moved with the king. It depended on presence. It could vanish the moment attention shifted. And that is why his life feels so intense in retrospect. Because he was always in motion across England, France, the Mediterranean, the Holy Land, back again, then into war once more. Even his death did not happen in a quiet palace, but at a siege, facing resistance at the edge of his own territory. There's a final irony in that. The man who spent so much of his life chasing control over distant cities and sacred places died, not in Jerusalem, not in a grand battlefield against a great king, but at a small castle in France, struck down by a single crossbow bolt during a relatively minor conflict. And yet that is also what makes his story feel so real. Because history is not only shaped by grand moments, it is often decided in small, unexpected ones. A decision to take a different route home, a moment of recognition on a road, a single shot fired from a wall, and then everything changes. So when we look back at Richard the Lionheart, what remains is not just the Crusader king, not just the warrior, not just the myth, but a reminder of how fragile even the greatest power can be, and how quickly history can turn a life into a legend. And that is where his story truly ends. Not in victory, not in defeat, but in memory. When Richard the Lionheart died in 1199 at Caylus-Chabrol Castle, the immediate reaction across Europe was not just mourning or remembrance, it was calculation. Power in the medieval world rarely stayed still, and the moment a strong ruler disappeared, the system around him began to shift almost instantly. And nowhere was that shift more dramatic than in the lands Richard had spent his life defending. Because Richard had not ruled a unified kingdom in the modern sense. What he controlled was a scattered empire of personal loyalties, inherited rights, contested territories, and fragile agreements stretched across England and large parts of France. It only held together because of him. And now he was gone. The first cracks appeared immediately within his own family. His brother John, King of England, took the English throne, but his authority was already weaker than Richard's had been. John inherited titles, but not the same respect, fear, or military reputation. In the medieval world, that difference mattered more than laws or paperwork. At the same time, in France, Philip II of France saw something else entirely. An opportunity. Philip had spent years fighting Richard across castles, rivers, and fortified cities. He had studied him closely, his speed, his aggressiveness, his refusal to back down from siege warfare. And now that the man himself was gone, Philip understood that the system Richard had built was finally vulnerable. But what followed next was not just a continuation of old rivalries. It was the beginning of a transformation in European power. Because Philip was not a crusader-style warrior king like Richard. He was something different, more administrative, more systematic, more focused on long-term control than battlefield reputation. Where Richard had moved constantly with armies, Philip began strengthening institutions, tightening loyalty, and slowly pulling territories into a more centralized royal structure. And this difference would change everything. To understand how big this shift was, imagine two styles of leadership colliding at the edge of medieval Europe. One style depends on personal presence. If the king is there, authority is strong. If he is absent, everything weakens. The other style builds structures that continue functioning even when the ruler is not physically present. Richard represented the first world. Philip represented the second. And after 1199, the second world began to win. One of the most important consequences of this shift was what later historians would call the gradual consolidation of the French crown's authority over regions that had once been loosely tied to the Angevin system. Territories like Normandy and Anjou, once controlled through Richard's personal authority and military response, now began drifting toward tighter Cape Tian control. This was not immediate conquest in a single dramatic moment. It was slower, more administrative, more persistent. Castles were taken. Nobles were persuaded or pressured. Legal claims were reinforced. And step by step, the balance of power shifted. At the same time, in England, John struggled to maintain the same level of control Richard had exercised almost instinctively. Rebellions emerged more frequently. Loyalty among nobles became more conditional. And the absence of Richard's military reputation made resistance more likely. But the story does not stop with political decline, because something else was happening in parallel. Richard's memory was growing, and that memory began to evolve in ways that shaped culture far beyond his lifetime. In the decades after his death, storytellers across Europe began to reshape the image of the crusading king. Chronicles that had once recorded events in relatively factual terms began blending history with moral interpretation. Songs, poems, and later legends began focusing on his bravery, his battles, his confrontation with Saladin, and his reputation as a king who embodied the ideal of knighthood. Over time, this image would become part of a much larger cultural pattern, because Richard was not the only figure to undergo this transformation. Across medieval and early modern history, powerful leaders often became symbols after their deaths. Their real decisions, political compromises, and contradictions were gradually simplified into narratives that people could easily remember and retell. And this process would not stop in the Middle Ages. Centuries later, when Europe entered the age of exploration and empire building, leaders were still being measured against similar ideals: courage, expansion, military success, personal presence on the battlefield. Even in much more modern contexts, echoes of this same standard can still be found in how societies remember wartime leaders or national founders. But Richard's case is one of the earliest and clearest examples of this transformation, because he lived at the exact point where medieval warfare, feudal politics, and crusading ideology all intersected. He was not just a king of England. He was a Duke of Aquitaine, a feudal lord in France, a crusader king in the Holy Land, and a central figure in a vast, unstable network of loyalties that stretched across continents. That complexity is what made his life so powerful in reality, and what made his legend so flexible in memory. And as Philip continued strengthening the French monarchy in the years after Richard's death, a new political reality slowly emerged. One where kings no longer needed to be constantly present everywhere. One where administration began to matter as much as personal leadership. One where centralized authority slowly replaced personal empire building. And that shift would eventually shape the entire future of Western Europe. But this is not just a story about kings and borders. Because beneath all of this political transformation, there's another thread that continues to run forward. The idea of what it means to lead in a world of instability. Richard represented one answer to that question. Lead from the front, act quickly, dominate through presence. Philip represented another. Build systems, strengthen institutions, outlast rivals. And history did not choose one instantly. It moved between both, sometimes favoring one, sometimes the other. After the death of Richard the Lionheart in 1199, the political map of Western Europe did not simply shift. It slowly reorganized itself around a new center of gravity. What had once been a system held together by personal rule, battlefield authority, and constant movement across territories began to give way to something more stable, more centralized, and ultimately more durable. At the heart of that transformation stood Philip II of France. Unlike Richard, Philip did not rely on personal presence across vast territories to maintain control. Instead, he focused on something more subtle but far more lasting: administration, legal authority, and the gradual extension of royal power into regions that had once operated with significant independence. Where Richard had ruled through movement and military response, Philip ruled through structure. And over time, structure proved harder to resist than even the strongest knight on a battlefield. One of the first major consequences of Richard's absence was the weakening of the Angevin political system itself. The lands that had once responded quickly to Richard's authority, Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and others, no longer had a figure who could personally enforce loyalty. His successor, John, King of England, inherited the crown, but not the same network of respect and fear that had made Richard effective in war. This difference mattered more than any single battle, because in the medieval world, authority was not abstract. It was constantly tested. A king who could not enforce obedience in person was a king whose power began to erode the moment he stopped being present. Philip understood this better than most. So instead of rushing into large-scale confrontations, he advanced carefully. He targeted key castles, encouraged defections, and used legal claims to justify his actions. Territories were not simply conquered. They were absorbed through a combination of pressure, negotiation, and opportunity. And slowly, this method began to work. Normandy, once one of the strongest pillars of Angevin power in France, became increasingly unstable under John's rule. Local nobles, sensing weakness, shifted loyalties. Castles that had once been firmly held began to change hands. The same pattern repeated across multiple regions, each loss reinforcing the next. What is important here is not just the military outcome, but the change in method. Richard's era had been defined by rapid campaigns, decisive sieges, and personal leadership on the battlefield. Philip's era was becoming defined by endurance, administration, and long-term control. This shift did not happen overnight. It unfolded over years, but its direction was clear. And as Philip strengthened his position, the idea of kingship itself began to evolve. In earlier medieval politics, a king was often expected to be first and foremost a warrior. Success in battle was not just military achievement, it was political legitimacy. A king who won battles was seen as favored by God, strengthened by fate, and justified in rule. Richard embodied that ideal more than almost any ruler of his time. But Philip represented something new. He did not rely on personal battlefield glory in the same way. Instead, he built a system where loyalty could be recorded, enforced, and maintained through officials, documents, and institutional authority. It was slower, less dramatic, but far more stable. And this stability would eventually outlast the personal empires of warrior kings. As the 13th century progressed, this difference became more visible. France, under Philip and his successors, began developing stronger royal administration. England, under John and later rulers, struggled with internal tension between monarchy and nobility. And this divergence can be traced directly back to the moment when Richard's personal empire ceased to exist. But there's another layer to this story that often gets overlooked. Because while political structures were changing, cultural memory was also being shaped at the same time. In England and across Europe, Richard's image did not fade after his death. Instead, it became more symbolic. Chroniclers and storytellers began to emphasize his crusading achievements, his courage, his confrontation with Saladin, and his identity as a king who spent his life in arms rather than administration. Over time, this selective memory created a powerful contrast. Richard became the ideal of the warrior king. Philip became the model of the administrative king. And these two archetypes would continue to influence how leadership was understood for centuries afterward. Even in much later historical periods, echoes of this divide can still be seen. Some rulers are remembered for battlefield presence and personal bravery, while others are remembered for institution building and long-term governance. Rarely does one figure embody both perfectly. Richard came closer than most to the first ideal. Philip came closer than most to the second. And the tension between them reflects a deeper truth about medieval power. It was never just about strength or intelligence alone, but about which kind of system could survive changing conditions. As the Angevin territories gradually shrank under Cape Tion pressure, a new political reality emerged in Western Europe. The idea of a personal empire spanning England and large parts of France became increasingly difficult to maintain. Geography, administration, and loyalty all pushed toward fragmentation or consolidation under stronger centralized rule. And in this environment, Philip's model began to dominate. But even as his political system strengthened, Richard's memory did something Philip's system could not fully control. It became myth. Stories of the crusading king spread across Europe. Minstrels sang about his bravery. Chroniclers recorded his battles in dramatic form. Later generations, especially during the rise of Romantic literature, would reinterpret him as a near-legendary figure, sometimes even blending him into fictional traditions of heroic knights. This is where history begins to overlap with storytelling. Because Richard's life did not just remain in historical records, it entered cultural imagination. And once that happens, a figure stops belonging only to their own time. They begin to belong to every time that retells them. So while Philip II reshaped the political structure of France, and John struggled to maintain English authority, Richard was already moving into a different kind of existence. Not as a ruling monarch, but as a narrative force. A symbol of what medieval kingship looked like at its most intense. And that symbol would continue to evolve long after the real political struggles of his era were forgotten. But the story does not end there. Because the world Richard left behind was not static. It continued to shift. As the early 13th century unfolded after the death of Richard the Lionheart, Europe entered a phase where the old rhythm of crusade, feudal war, and personal kingship slowly began to change shape. The world Richard had lived in, where authority often depended on a ruler's physical presence on campaign, where castles were taken and retaken in cycles of siege warfare, and where loyalty could shift rapidly between overlords, was beginning to evolve into something more structured and less personal. At the center of that shift still stood Philip II of France, whose reign continued to strengthen the French monarchy long after Richard was gone. Philip's approach to power was methodical. Reclaim territories step by step, strengthen legal claims, appoint reliable officials, and reduce dependence on individual nobles whose loyalties could change. In doing so, he helped lay the foundation for a more centralized royal state, one that did not rely as heavily on the personal charisma of a single warrior king. Meanwhile, in England, John, King of England, struggled to maintain authority over the same vast territories Richard had once controlled. But the conditions had already changed. The Angevin system, which depended so heavily on Richard's military presence and rapid intervention, was no longer functioning in the same way. Without him, the fragile balance of loyalty across England and France began to break apart. But while the political map shifted, something equally important was happening in the cultural and religious world that Richard had once helped define: the world of crusading. The Third Crusade, in which Richard had fought against Saladin, did not fully achieve its ultimate goal of reclaiming Jerusalem. Yet it left behind something powerful, a model of kingship tied directly to holy war, military leadership, and international Christian identity. Even though Jerusalem remained outside Christian control, the idea of crusade itself became deeply embedded in European thinking. In the decades that followed, this idea did not disappear. Instead, it expanded. New crusades were called, not just toward the Holy Land, but also into other regions considered part of the broader struggle of Christendom. Military campaigns in Iberia against Muslim kingdoms, conflicts in the Baltic region, and internal struggles within Europe were all increasingly framed using crusading language. What had once been a specific response to the loss of Jerusalem gradually became a broader political and religious tool. And in many of these later campaigns, the memory of Richard played a subtle but important role. He had become a reference point, a symbol of what a crusading king looked like at his most effective: militarily aggressive, personally involved in warfare, capable of both organizing large sieges and inspiring loyalty among diverse forces. But this idealized image also began to separate from reality, because the actual structure of European politics was changing in ways that made Richard's style of kingship increasingly difficult to sustain. Larger administrative systems were developing. Written law and record-keeping were becoming more important. Kings were less dependent on constant movement and more reliant on councils, officials, and institutional continuity. In other words, power was becoming less mobile and more fixed. This change can be seen clearly in the contrast between Richard's reign and the later policies of Philip II. Where Richard spent most of his time traveling between conflicts, Philip built a more stable administrative core around Paris. Where Richard relied on rapid military response, Philip invested in long-term control of territory through legal and bureaucratic means. Neither approach was entirely superior in every situation, but over time, Philip's model proved more sustainable. As these systems developed, the memory of Richard continued to evolve as well. Chroniclers in England, particularly those writing in the decades after his death, emphasized his courage, his crusading exploits, and his identity as a king who fought in the East. Over time, these accounts blended into a larger cultural tradition that presented him as one of the great archetypes of medieval knighthood. This is where history begins to merge with legend in a very noticeable way. Richard was no longer just a historical figure recorded in chronicles. He became a character in cultural storytelling. Songs, poems, and later romanticized narratives portrayed him as the ideal warrior king, sometimes even placing him in imagined adventures that went beyond his actual historical actions. And this process did not stop in the Middle Ages. Centuries later, during the development of European literature and historical storytelling traditions, figures like Richard continued to be reinterpreted. Writers used him as a reference point for leadership, courage, and martial identity. Even in much later periods of European history, echoes of his image can still be found in how military leadership and royal authority were described. But what makes his case especially important is the tension between two realities. On one hand, the real Richard was a highly effective military commander, a complex political actor, and a ruler whose decisions shaped the balance of power across England and France. On the other hand, the remembered Richard became something more simplified, a symbol of crusading valor and medieval chivalry. And that tension between reality and memory is not unique to him. It appears repeatedly across history whenever a figure's life intersects with major cultural or political turning points. As Philip's France continued to strengthen and expand its centralized authority, and as the crusading era slowly shifted into new forms of religious and military conflict, Europe itself was entering a transitional period. The old feudal patterns were not disappearing overnight, but they were gradually being reshaped by administrative growth, legal systems, and emerging ideas of territorial governance. And in the background of all this change, Richard's legacy remained present, not as an active force in politics anymore, but as a reference point for what had come before. A reminder of an era when kings rode at the front of armies, when empires were held together by movement rather than administration, when the fate of cities could turn on the presence or absence of a single ruler. And as Europe continued forward into new conflicts, new monarchies, and new political structures, that older world did not vanish completely. It remained alive in memory, in story, and in the enduring image of a king who once crossed continents to fight for a city he never fully captured, but who became immortal in the process of trying. As the 13th century continued to unfold after the legacies of Richard the Lionheart and Philip II of France, the world they had shaped through war, diplomacy, and ambition gradually dissolved into something new. It did not collapse suddenly. It changed through accumulation, small administrative decisions, territorial consolidations, and shifting ideas of authority that slowly rewired how power worked in Western Europe. The crusading world that Richard had entered at the end of the 12th century was already beginning to lose its original intensity. The idea of massive, unified expeditions led by kings across continents became increasingly difficult to sustain. Later, crusades still happened, but they were more fragmented, more political, and often less focused on a single overwhelming goal like the recapture of Jerusalem. Even the memory of Jerusalem itself, so central to Richard's life, began to function differently in European politics. It remained sacred, still powerful in religious imagination, but the practical urgency that had driven the Third Crusade slowly diminished as new priorities emerged closer to home. At the same time, the political structures that Philip had strengthened continued to grow. The French monarchy developed stronger administrative systems, more consistent taxation, and a clearer sense of territorial authority. The idea of a kingdom was slowly shifting from being a collection of personal loyalties tied to a ruler's presence into something more fixed, defined by borders, institutions, and written law. In England, the consequences of this shift became more visible in the decades after John's reign. The tensions between monarchy and nobility, already present in his time, eventually contributed to major constitutional developments. One of the most famous results of that long process was the emergence of the Magna Carta in 1215, a document that reflected the growing expectation that even kings were subject to legal limits. This was a very different world from Richard's. In Richard's time, authority was proven in motion, on campaign, at siege, in direct confrontation with rivals like Saladin or Philip. In the emerging world of the 13th century, authority was increasingly expressed through law, record, and institutional continuity. But even as the political landscape changed, Richard himself did not disappear from cultural memory. Instead, he became part of something larger. Across medieval Europe, especially in England, stories of Richard continue to circulate. He was remembered as the Crusader king who had crossed the sea to fight for Jerusalem, who had faced Saladin in a war that stretched across continents, and who had embodied the ideals of knighthood in a way few rulers ever matched. Over time, this memory grew beyond historical record. It entered literature, legend, and popular storytelling traditions. In some later retellings, he became almost a character in a larger heroic cycle, sometimes even placed alongside fictional heroes of medieval romance. The historical details blurred, but the symbolic meaning strengthened. Richard became less of a man and more of an idea. The idea of the warrior king. The idea of leadership defined by courage, mobility, and personal risk. And that idea continued to echo long after the medieval world itself began to fade. Because what replaced the age of Richard and Philip was not a single new system, but a gradual transformation into early modern Europe. States became more centralized. Armies became more professional. Kings became less dependent on personal battlefield presence and more dependent on administration, finance, and bureaucracy. Wars still happened, but they were fought differently. Power still mattered, but it was organized differently. And leadership still required strength, but the definition of strength itself had changed. Yet, even in this new world, the memory of figures like Richard remained powerful. He represented a time when the world felt more direct, more personal, and more visibly shaped by individual action. A time when a king could leave his kingdom, fight across the world, and still be remembered primarily for what he did with a sword rather than what he managed in an office. But history rarely preserves only one version of the truth. Richard was not just a symbol of chivalry. He was also a product of a system that demanded constant war, unstable loyalty, and relentless movement across territories that could not easily be unified. His life reflected both the brilliance and the limits of that world. And when that world changed, his kind of kingship became increasingly rare, eventually almost impossible to sustain. So in the end, what remains is not just the story of a single king, but the end of an entire era of power. An era where empires could be held together by presence, where loyalty could shift with the arrival of a ruler, where battles decided not just territory, but legitimacy itself. That world faded slowly, and something else took its place. But Richard's story did not end with that transition. It continued in memory, in legend, and in the way later generations imagined what it meant to be a king, a warrior, and a leader. And that is why his story still gets told. Not because it is simple, but because it marks the moment when one kind of world ended and another began to take shape.